Welcome back to RSA Conference 2021, live from Virtual Broadcast Alley. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this segment is Deepika Gajaria. She is the Vice President of Product at Tala Security. Welcome, Deepika, to Security Weekly.
Thank you very much, Matt. Glad to be here.
Now, we had an awesome interview last night with Anand on Application Security Weekly around web security and privacy, and in this segment we're going to talk about some of the new areas of privacy, and how do you enforce those privacy settings specifically in the browser, because as we think about all the third-party plugins and all the other things that happen at the browser level, create some interesting challenges. But let's start with what's happening in the privacy space.
Absolutely. And I think you hit it on the head, right? The browser is where we focus. And I wanted to just take a step back and talk a little bit about where we are today, right? So you don't have to look very hard to find stories about privacy breaches, ransomware attacks, and so on and so forth. And I think what stands out with all of us is sort of the lack of preparedness that enterprises have, given all of these implications that you get with compliance regulations like the GDPRs and the CCPAs of the world. And if you look back not that far ago, just 45, 50 years ago, when the US Privacy Act came out, they focused on how the US government was collecting data from its citizens, how they were sharing data between organizations and consent and so on and so forth. And if you fast forward to today, think of that same paradigm on the web, think of that same paradigm for data privacy, right? So there are two aspects or two sides of the coin with consumers and with enterprises, right? So consumers are always concerned about who has access to my data, what are they doing with it, did I give them consent to do anything with it? And on the enterprise side, they're answering those same questions. They have a vast supply chain, right? So they have third-party vendors, and we've seen that with a lot of these websites have a lot of third parties that have marketing chatbots, they have analytics tools, performance tools, etc. But what ends up happening is a lot of these third parties then have access to their customer data. So I think when you really look at where the privacy space is today, at least on the web, it's still sort of the wild, wild west in terms of who has access, why they have access, and what they're doing with that data. So that's sort of where we focus on, at least in Tala Security, we focus on the privacy of the web, its implications, and what tools you have between sort of security organizations and the privacy organization to ensure that breaches don't happen, number one, data oversharing isn't happening without your consent, and then the controls and the automation that can keep you in check along the way.
Yeah, I think a really good example of this is every time you go to a website, there's at least two things that pop up. Number one is cookies, and whether you're going to accept cookies or not, and GDPR really enforced the whole cookie accept process. The other thing is, because I have my browser so locked down, it asks whether I can share my location or other aspects of access to my camera or my microphone or my whatever, right? And that's because I have a pretty locked down browser, probably not as locked down as it maybe should be. But I mean, these are the first things that people see sometimes when they go to a brand new website. And that is driven by GDPR, and that's driven by privacy requirements. But not every organization enforces that lockdown at the browser to make people either accept or block certain aspects of what the browser wants to collect.
Yeah, absolutely. And if the one thing that you hit on, right? So there's one aspect of, yes, enterprises have a checkbox. If you make cookie consent banners, we all have seen it, we all accept it, and, we kind of go, okay, there's yet another one I have to select. But then what? So one aspect of it is, yes, adhering to what governance is telling you to do. But the second aspect is, are you really honoring my preferences as a consumer when I make those selections, right? And that is the key. And that's the key where when we talk about privacy and security and the convergence or the intersection of those, that is where the controls come in place. And you spoke about one where, okay, they're asking for my microphone access. Well, yes, enterprises can actually limit what, say, third-party vendors that are on their site can actually access. There's a wide variety of controls, right? So you can talk about CSP, which is content security policy, where you can lock down who your vendors actually can, or who your vendors actually are on your site, different aspects of your site. But there's things like feature policy. A lot of these browsers support where you could say, well, this vendor has access to cameras and or not, and you have all of these sort of limitations or locking down in place of what preferences can be honored. And I think that's the key. And when you think about, I think CCPA has something, and they've actually enforced more of these under the privacy aspect of it, is consumers now also have a right to ask enterprises if all those consents or the preferences that they've requested has actually been honored. So now it's kind of coming full circle. Enterprises can't just give them sort of the cookie consent panel. They actually have to make sure the right policies are then put in place. And in fact, we had a great conversation with one of our customers recently. This use case actually came from the security team, which was a little different, right? Because you always think privacy teams are the ones, or the compliance teams are the ones looking for this. But how do they then translate those, the requirements, if you may, into the technology and the process that the security team had to then adhere to? So I think it's great. Organizations still are siloed in the sense that privacy compliance teams are one side of the house, kind of the legal side, and then there's the technology side. But if you really want to be sort of privacy first, security first, and all these practices we talk about as an industry, you kind of have to get to the crux of the problem where it's one and the same. You've got to have controls and remediation based on what you find on the privacy aspect of the house.
Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge in the browser is enforcing, or building the policy to then enforce the policy. Now, there are capabilities within the browsers, but if you're in an environment that has multiple browser support, trying to manage all this individually probably gets a little challenging. So how do you set kind of that corporate privacy policy that you want to enforce across all the browsers, regardless of what your employees are using, and then know that you're staying within those policies? That's a challenge, because, like I said, the individual browsers support these capabilities, but to do it at scale and to do it across multiple browsers is not that easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And fortunately, at least some of the top 3 browsers, if you may, that most consumers are using do support a lot of these policies, right? And that's the beauty of kind of using standards-based controls, which is sort of what we do on the security platform that we already have. And when you translate that over, even on the privacy side, depending on what browser technology you're using, feature sets like content security policy will actually give you the policies that your browser will then accept. And that's the beauty about that. And it's not just CSP and some other stuff, right? So there's a number of technologies out there. And as and when, users are kind of moving between browsers, they get specific sort of policies, if you may, based on their preferences. And that's the beauty about it. And yeah, go ahead, Matt.
No, I was going to say, so that's great. I mean, I can enforce the policy. How do I audit against the policy? What is the data that comes back that says, yes, we didn't allow access to my location, my camera, my whatever? Because the second point that you made in your kind of opening statement was, it's not only the policy, but you've got to prove the policy. And then let's say that a piece of data was collected that I didn't really give them access to. How do I get rid of it, right? I mean, that's one of the fun things with GDPR, is the ability to understand what data they're collecting and the ability to delete that data. That's a challenge if you don't have an audit mechanism in place to also validate that policy is not collecting that data.
Yeah, and there are multiple things, right, based on what you said. So if you take a step even further back, before you even get into this whole audit process, we've seen this firsthand, right? We talk to customers day in and day out on their security posture, if you may. They're always concerned about data exfiltration. And then when you think about this problem, it goes hand in hand with the privacy piece. Well, third parties are rampant, right? So we all know that. SolarWinds told us that we not only need to worry about our own security posture, we also need to look at the vendor security posture. And then you think about it, if there are X number of third parties, and in some websites or some enterprises, they don't even have a sense of who those third parties are, let alone what those third parties are collecting and why they're even there, right? So that's sort of that first side. Before you can even audit sort of your privacy policies, you first have to get a good inventory, if you may. And the second aspect is now there's again multiple teams. There's the marketing team that's obviously adding all of these tag managers and chatbots, etc., for rightfully so for their business needs. The GRC team has, a list of compliance checks that they need to do. So the whole piece, again, around the silos that there are in enterprises have to go away. And CISOs also, right? They're tasked with so many things. There's the OWASP top 10 that they need to deal with. Now they need to deal with, they don't want to be inhibitors in a way to say, okay, you're not allowed to add these third parties on the site. So there has to be that process from early on. Everything from developers vetting what code they're adding, who these vendors are, if the reputation's okay, to the vendor sort of agreements that the GRC teams and others have to adhere to, right? So I think vendor risk assessment teams, if anything, have to be sort of in the mix from the beginning in trying to understand why these vendors are on the site, what their purpose is, and how they're being used. And to your point on sort of that continuous audit, that's essentially what we do. At least at Tala, what we're trying to do is we don't want to have this manual approach. It's after the fact, if there's some, if there's a breach that happened or whatever it may be, but it's something that it's like an ongoing process that the security teams are involved with, the privacy teams gets reports on, and then we're monitoring all of these sort of vendors, their reputation, the sort of the access level, if you may, of what data they have, etc. So to your point, absolutely, it's not a one-time process. It's not one team. In fact, it's a group of people who have to work together. And that is where I think the challenge is. And that's where there's a lot of promise, because there's a lot that can be done in that case.
Yeah, I want to double click on the third-party piece for a second, because I ran a third-party vendor management program for one of the large national banks, had to manage 70,000 vendors. I can tell you for a fact, Google Analytics, HubSpot, pick your form product of the day, they weren't even on my list, right? But to this third party component, these are things that you embed into your website to collect information, but yet you don't fully understand the security or what they're doing with that data, or sometimes even the data that's going out, to even add it into a third-party vendor management program. Because we think about, our third-party vendors as, who's processing our data over here, who's doing our printing over here, or what other services. Sometimes I don't think the third-party vendor management teams are even thinking about, well, what's Google Analytics doing on your website? What is that form from HubSpot collecting on your website? Those are all third-party relationships. All that data is being stored and collected and stored somewhere outside of your environment. And those are some big challenges for third-party vendor management.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there again, if you break this down again in terms of the silos and where in the process this needs to happen, right? So there are two pieces. There's data at rest in all of these databases that we've already collected. Me as an enterprise owner saying, okay, you know what, we're handling this data. Okay, our data retention policies, data sharing, etc. And that's probably where the process aspect comes in, where it was all manual. It was in some database or some checklist based on what the vendors were or who the vendors are, right? But this is what I'm talking about in terms of the website, right? It's ever changing and it's evolving day to day. I mean, I do that on our website, on the Tala website. I'm going, well, you know what, can we add a tag to see who's, inputting form information? Do I talk to the security team every single time? Probably not, right? So that is exactly the challenge. And that is the reason why you need a tool that's constantly sort of monitoring and scanning your resources. And that's where you'll pick it up. And also where in the process you hit the sort of the idea of, well, it's after the fact, right? Well, if I'm a developer adding code and I'm already adding in integrations, certain vendors, the scripts or whatever, so on and so forth, and marketing teams are then adding additional pieces, all of that is then picked up. Especially with a scanner like what we do with Tala, we detect all of that firsthand when we scan. And the aspect of the audit is that it is continuous, right? So we will then alert you. And that is the piece I was talking about. A lot of the awareness is also missing, right? So the vendor assessment teams probably don't even know what's on their site. So I think the first step really is trying to break down those silos, have that good sense of what's on your site, ensure that you're being compliant, and then have some automated process. So it's the three things that I talk about is people, process, and technology. You want to make sure all the teams are aligned in terms of whatever you need to do. You have the processes in place, who needs to do what, and that's critical, much easier said than done. And then the technologies or the tools that can aid you to do that more sort of efficiently.
Yeah, one of the areas we touched on a little bit last night with Anand, I'm curious on your take on this and how you do it is, when we think about, yes, I get the data, the process side, right? The one thing development teams don't want is to be slowed down. The marketing teams definitely don't want to be slowed down, right? They want to add these tags. Is there anything we can do proactively? I mean, process is part of it, but can we bring technology and process a little closer together so that when the marketing team makes a change to the website to insert a new tag or insert a new form or something like that, that it can be a little more proactive so it's not after the fact? Because those processes, if they take too long, everybody's going to bypass them, right? Because that's just what we do as humans. I'm just curious how you can support some of that more real-time proactive capabilities just to make it easier for all the teams to do what they need to do, their jobs, right, but also make sure that the right privacy and security settings are in place for those third-party components.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you an example of how one of our large customers does it, right? It's a large financial. There are multiple teams doing this. And to your point, the security team in no way, who's sort of the central governing body, if you may, wants to slow things down. So there are two things. We touched a little bit on sort of that CI/CD pipeline, or where in the development and sort of the production or pre-production and staging environments where some of this can be done. But there's also a notion of, can we have a central repository, right? So a lot of enterprises have a good sense of who these vendors are, to the point where who's in their allow list, if you may, of reputed vendors. That's one thing. But who's vetting them? Is there a process where you can do that in an automated way, where you can input, say, certain vendors or certain scripts in this case, and then a technology like Tala vets them, looks at the reputation, says, okay, check, it looks okay. So you can go through the next step of the process where you can then add it on, right? So I think having that central repository where somebody is continuously monitoring resources, ensuring that there is a hop with the security team in the middle, right? In terms of not just a checkbox saying, okay, they've reviewed the code, but that's an inbuilt process that they already have, where prior to releasing any code on the website, they have to kind of go through that process. And like I said, I think CISOs have enough on their plate, right? So they're already dealing with so many attacks, vectors, and things. But when you think about it, data exposure recently made it to the top 3 in the OWASP, right? So the list. So this is not something that's after the fact. It's so closely related to all the other initiatives that's going on the security side, right? And that's, I think, one thing I'd like to urge enterprises to think about is it's one and the same, in that one can be solved with the other. And it's critical to have both aligned in terms of even the teams and even the processes in place.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, do I think about my third-party vendor management, having vetted my vendors, vetted who's allowed to have those third-party plugins, knowing that the reputation is right, then integrating that with more on the development and marketing teams to say, these are the things you're allowed to have in, and anything else is an exception that has to go through a more formal review. But outside of that, now I know who my vendors are. I know their reputation's good. I know that these are validated as part of my pre-production to release stage. And then you just deal with the exceptions, because otherwise I think this gets a little challenging.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think to your point, there has to be some sort of a balance. I mean, CISOs, CPOs, like privacy officers, you kind of have to balance business needs. You can't have things, even with cookie preferences. If I choose none as a consumer and say, I don't want anything on there, I'm going to kind of get a suboptimal experience on your site, right? So if I don't want it optimized. So in a similar way, when you're looking at sort of security and privacy, you need to balance business needs. You want to make sure things are, and the primary goal again on the website is making sure consumers have that best experience online. But part of that also is you want to make sure you're safeguarding their data. So you need to have a clear balance on that. And I think having that privacy first attitude and that privacy program overall, and we're seeing that more, right? With sort of hacks, like I said, with SolarWinds, it's kind of gotten it to the forefront where third-party assessment is one thing, but you want to make sure their security posture and their privacy posture is also suitable for you as an enterprise. So I think they're all moving in the right step, and even sort of the new cybersecurity task force that we have, they're talking about that repository, right? That we can kind of, enterprises can look into. So all of those things, I think, go in with what Tala is doing and how we want to align with security teams, but also enable privacy teams, help them honor all of these sort of consumer protection, pieces that compliance regulations get you, but also do that in a very seamless, ongoing fashion. So it's not one time set and forget, but you can actually monitor this and make it more automated for you.
Yeah, we're going to see more privacy regulation, not less. I'm just hoping we do it at more of a national level so it makes it a little easier to manage versus the breach laws, which were 50 states. And yeah, hopefully we'll make some progress there on that front. But we're big believers that, if we can do this at a more national level, it will streamline, hopefully, the privacy requirements and some of the privacy policies that organizations need to implement instead of creating 50 variations of a privacy requirement.
Absolutely. I don't think any organization is equipped to looking at that full time. And I think having sort of that privacy first approach where it's in your design principles and it's part of your DNA in some sense is the way to go. And absolutely, GDPR is great for Europe. I mean, I know in the US we've been talking about more and more of this, but really it's those 3 or 4 basic questions. Who has access to what data, why they are, and if they are, then what do you do about it? And that's the piece that has to be sort of, baked into place.
Great. Deepika, thank you so much for joining us on Security Weekly.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to this in the future.
Yes. And if anybody wants to learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/Tala Security. That is the end of our micro interview live stream for today. But stay tuned. Business Security Weekly is coming up next.